The year was 1877, a time when the western frontier remained as unforgiving as it was promising, where the towering Sangre de Cristo Mountains cast long shadows over those brave or foolish enough to test their will against wilderness. Courage was measured by one's ability to endure, and kindness was a luxury many couldn't afford. This is the remarkable story of Margaret Holloway, a woman who lost her sight but discovered her resilience, and Running Elk, a Kiowa scout whose understanding of the land transcended the boundaries that divided their worlds. The autumn of 1877 painted the Colorado mountains with brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. Aspens quivered in mountain breezes, their yellowing leaves catching sunlight like thousands of coins. But beneath this splendor, winter's first cold breath already threaded through the valleys, a warning of the merciless season ahead. The grinding sound of wagon wheels against stone and root broke the wilderness silence as a small company of settlers made their slow, determined journey toward the mining settlement of Silver Creek. Margaret Holloway sat at the edge of her wagon bed, fingers tracing the worn leather journal in her lap. Though her eyes remained open, they registered nothing but vague patterns of light and dark, the lingering vestiges of vision that typhoid had left her 4 years prior. At 31, she had learned to navigate her blindness with quiet determination, relying on her other senses to construct a mental map of her surroundings. "We'll make camp at Falcon Ridge tonight," called Jeremiah Webster, the expedition leader, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who had guided too many hopeful settlers through treacherous terrain. "One more day to Silver Creek, God willing, and the weather holds." Margaret reached for her canteen, the tepid water washing away the dust that coated her throat. The journey had proven more arduous than any had anticipated, supplies dwindling faster than planned, tempers fraying as the elevation increased and oxygen thinned. She was keenly aware of the whispers that followed her, the blind woman, the burden. Her brother-in-law, Richard Holloway, had made little effort to hide his resentment at being responsible for her welfare after her husband Daniel had died. At Antietam 14 years ago, the Holloways had only taken her in after Daniel's death because of the modest military pension she received. Now that Richard had convinced her to exchange that guaranteed income for a stake in his mining venture, her utility was rapidly diminishing in his eyes. With each passing mile, his patience wore thinner. "Margaret," Sarah Holloway's voice cut through her thoughts, tight with barely restrained irritation. "The flour stores are nearly depleted again. Have you been taking extra portions?" "No, Sarah," Margaret replied evenly, refusing to be baited into an argument. "Just the morning ration we all agreed upon." "Well, someone has been helping themselves, and we've still got mountain passes ahead of us." Sarah's skirts rustled as she moved away, leaving behind the scent of rosewater pomade and simmering hostility. The wagon lurched over a rock, and Margaret steadied herself, her fingers finding the small bundle tucked beside her, all she had left in the world. A change of clothes, a tin cup, her husband's pocket watch that had been returned to her with his effects, and a well-worn copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, with its pages cut so she could trace the indentations of the words with her fingertips. During the quiet hours when sleep evaded her, by late afternoon the air grew heavy with the metallic scent of approaching rain. Margaret could smell it coming, that peculiar sharp tang that preceded mountain storms. The caravan's pace quickened as Webster called orders from the lead wagon. "Storms coming fast, might be worse than we thought." His voice carried a note of genuine alarm that sent a shiver through Margaret, despite the heavy wool of her shawl. The first fat raindrops struck her face as the wagons groaned to a halt around her. Chaos erupted immediately, men shouting orders, women gathering children close, horses whinnying nervously as they sensed the rapidly changing barometric pressure. Margaret remained where she was, knowing she would only complicate matters if she tried to help. "Get the supplies covered," Webster bellowed over the rising wind. "Tie down anything that might blow away." Lightning split the sky, illuminating Margaret's darkened world for a split second, the flash bright enough that even her damaged eyes could perceive it. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the ground beneath the wagons. The storm had arrived, with a ferocity that stunned even those accustomed to mountain weather. "The creek's rising," someone shouted in alarm. "We need to move to higher ground." Cold water began to splash beneath the wagon, and Margaret felt the first genuine stirrings of fear. She clutched her bundle to her chest. "Sarah!" she called out. "Richard!" Only the roar of the storm answered her. Water began to seep through, the floorboards soaking the hem of her dress. Margaret moved toward the front of the wagon, feeling her way carefully along its sides. "Is anyone there?" she called again, louder this time, fighting to be heard over the storm's fury. Rough hands suddenly grasped her arm, pulling her forward without ceremony. "Move!" Richard's voice, sharp with fear. "The wagons are flooding. Everyone's heading for the ridge." He half-dragged her through the mud, her boots slipping on the slick ground. The rain was a solid sheet of water, disorienting even to those who could see. Margaret stumbled and fell to her knees, the cold mud soaking through her skirts. "Get up!" Richard yanked her to her feet. "I swear, Margaret, you're more trouble than—" His words cut off as another crack of thunder split the air. They struggled upward, the incline growing steeper beneath her feet. Margaret's lungs burned with the effort, her free hand clutching her precious bundle while Richard pulled her forward by the other arm. The sounds of the caravan, shouting voices, crying children, frightened animals, grew fainter, either lost in the storm's fury or due to increasing distance. She couldn't tell which. "Wait here!" Richard ordered suddenly, pressing her against what felt like the rough bark of a pine tree. "I need to help Webster with the horses. Don't move an inch." His presence vanished before she could respond. The sound of his retreating footsteps quickly swallowed by the storm. Margaret stood perfectly still, rain cascading down her face, her back pressed against the tree's solidity. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The storm's intensity began to wane, thunder now a distant grumble rather than earth-shaking explosions. "Richard?" she called hesitantly, then louder. "Sarah? Anyone from the caravan?" Only the diminishing patter of rain and the drip of water from leaves answered her. Dread pooled in her stomach, colder than the rain that had soaked her to the skin. She had been abandoned. Margaret slid down the trunk until she sat on the sodden ground, her bundle clutched to her chest. The enormity of her situation crashed over her like another wave of the storm. Blind, alone in wilderness, she could not navigate, with no shelter, little food, and no means to make fire. If the elements didn't claim her, predators surely would. As darkness fell, not that it made much difference to her world of shadows, the temperature dropped sharply. Margaret's wet clothes clung to her skin, drawing heat from her body with cruel efficiency. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably as bitter mountain cold settled into her bones. She considered trying to find the caravan, but in her blindness, each step risked a deadly fall, down the unfamiliar slope or into a ravine she couldn't see. "So this is how it ends," she whispered to herself, a strange calm settling over her despite her dire circumstances. There was almost relief in the finality of it. No more pitying glances she couldn't see but could feel like physical touch. No, more being the burden, the afterthought, the problem to be managed. The night deepened around her, mountain insects resuming their chorus after the storm. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, 3 sharp yips that echoed through the trees. Margaret leaned her head back against the trunk, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She should try to stay awake, she knew, but the cold made her thoughts sluggish, her body heavy with a dangerous desire to sleep. Just as consciousness began to slip away, another sound cut through the night, deliberate footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Not the heavy tread of Richard or any of the caravan men, these steps were lighter, more measured, as if the walker knew exactly how to place each foot for maximum silence. Margaret froze, hardly daring to breathe. Bear, wolf, or something worse. She had heard whispers around campfires about renegade bands that preyed on vulnerable travelers, stories she was never meant to overhear. The footsteps paused. She could feel a presence nearby, watching her. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it could be heard. Then a voice spoke deep and clear, with an accent she had never heard before. "You are far from your people, blind one." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She turned her face toward the voice, her useless eyes wide with fear and desperate hope. "They left me," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "The storm came, and they left me." A moment of silence followed, heavy with judgment, not for her, but for those who had abandoned her. Then the stranger spoke again. "Night comes. Cold deepens. You will die here, alone." It wasn't a threat, merely a statement of fact delivered, with the same dispassionate certainty as one might remark on approaching rain or the sun's position. "I know," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Another silence, then the rustle of movement as the stranger crouched beside her. She could sense his proximity, smell leather and sage and wood smoke on his clothes. "I am called Swift Arrow by the army scouts. The Kiowa know me as Mahwissa, Running Elk." The voice held neither pity nor promise. "What are you called, blind? Woman of the settlers?" "Margaret Holloway," she answered, turning her face toward the sound of his voice, "and I don't want to die in these mountains." "Can you stand?" Running Elk asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Margaret nodded, struggling. To her feet, with limbs stiffened by cold and fear, her fingers clutched her small bundle of possessions as if it were a lifeline to the world she had lost. "The storm has passed, but your people have gone," Running Elk continued. "They traveled north along the ridge, too far now to reach before dawn." Margaret swallowed hard, forcing back the wave of despair that threatened to engulf her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her abandonment real. "They didn't look for me," she said. "It wasn't a question." One man called. "Your name 3 times," Running Elk replied evenly. Then another spoke, said you had probably fallen into the creek. The woman cried, but they continued on. Richard and Sarah, fulfilling only the barest obligation of conscience before leaving her to die. Margaret's jaw tightened. "They never intended to find me." Running Elk made a sound that might have been agreement. "Night grows colder. We cannot stay here." "We?" Margaret turned her face toward his voice, surprise evident in her sightless eyes. "Unless you prefer to remain," he answered, a hint of dry humor in his otherwise serious tone. A breathless laugh escaped her. "I prefer to live." "Then we go. My shelter is not far, but the path is difficult. Can you follow?" Margaret hesitated. Everything she had been taught warned against trusting a stranger, especially one from a tribe white settlers often regarded with suspicion or outright hostility. But what choice did she have? "I can follow your voice," she said finally. "But I cannot see where to place my feet." Running Elk was silent for a moment, considering. "Give me your hand," he said at last. Margaret reached out tentatively, her hand wavering in the space between them. Warm, calloused fingers wrapped around her wrist, not roughly as Richard had done, but with firm, steady pressure. "I will guide. You tell me when you tire or when the path becomes too difficult." They set off through the forest, moving at a deliberate pace. Running Elk walked slightly ahead of her, his grip on her wrist maintaining just enough tension to communicate direction and obstacles. When a fallen log blocked their path, he guided her hand to feel its height. When the ground dipped suddenly, his grip tightened in warning. "The storm has changed the land," he explained, helping her navigate a section where mud slid treacherously beneath their feet. "Water carves new paths through soil. What was safe yesterday may not be safe today." Margaret stumbled once, her breath catching as her foot slipped on wet leaves. Running Elk steadied her instantly, his other hand catching her elbow. "Thank you," she murmured, embarrassed by her helplessness, yet grateful for his patience. They continued in silence for a time, the forest alive with night sounds around them. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the steady drip of rainwater from laden branches. "How did you lose your sight?" Running Elk asked suddenly, his voice breaking the rhythm of their journey. Margaret's lips pressed together, the memory still painful despite the passage of time. "Typhoid, 4 years ago. It took my parents and left me in darkness." She didn't add how quickly friends had fallen away, how potential suitors had vanished, how her life had narrowed to dependence on reluctant relatives. "The fever that burns the eyes," Running Elk nodded, though she couldn't see it. "We have known this sickness too." His words held no pity, which Margaret found strangely comforting. Pity was a burden heavier than blindness itself. The terrain changed beneath her feet, from the soft give of forest floor to a harder, rockier surface. The air shifted too, cooler with the scent of water nearby. "We follow the stream now," Running Elk explained. "It leads to where I have made camp. You don't live with your people?" Margaret asked, curiosity momentarily distracting her from her discomfort. A lengthy pause followed. "I travel between worlds," he finally said. "Scout for the army at Fort Carson, guide for settlers when they pay well, trusted by both, belonging to neither." The complexity in those simple words struck Margaret deeply. Here was someone who understood isolation, though of a different kind than hers. "Your English is very good," she observed. "Agency school until I was 14, he replied. "Then 4 years with Colonel Harrison's cavalry unit as translator and scout. And now you're helping a blind woman through the wilderness," Margaret said, unable to keep a hint of bitter humor from her voice. "Surely not what you planned for this night. Plans are for those who believe they control the path ahead," Running Elk said, something like amusement warming his voice. "I have learned to follow the trail that opens before me." They walked in, silence again, Margaret concentrating on keeping her footing on the increasingly rocky ground beside the stream. The rush of water grew louder, surrounding them, its sound bouncing off what must be steep canyon walls. "We cross here." "Running," Elk announced, stopping suddenly. "The water is not deep, but the stones are slippery. I will carry you." Before Margaret could protest, he had taken her bundle and secured it somewhere on his person. Then strong arms lifted her effortlessly, one behind her back, the other beneath her knees. She instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, startled by the sudden proximity. Running Elk stepped into the stream, his movements careful but confident as he navigated the crossing. Margaret could feel the tensing of his muscles as he balanced on submerged stones, the slight adjustments he made when one shifted beneath his weight. The water gurgled around them, its cold spray occasionally touching her face. "We have crossed," he informed her as he set her gently on her feet on the opposite bank. "Thank you," Margaret said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks despite the cool night air. It had been years since anyone had carried her, treated her with such considerate strength. They continued on, the path beginning to slope upward. The forest. Sounds changed subtly. Fewer insects, more wind through branches. Margaret sensed they were climbing toward more exposed terrain. "The shelter is ahead," Running Elk said, after they had climbed in silence for several minutes. "A small cabin in the hillside, solid but simple." "How did you find me?" Margaret asked, the question that had been nagging at her finally breaking free. "Of all the places in these mountains, how did you come to be where I was left?" Running, Elk was quiet for several paces before answering. "I have watched your caravan since yesterday. I track all who pass through Kiowa hunting grounds. Were you planning to approach them?" "No. They were too many, too armed, too fearful." His voice held no accusation, merely observation. "But when the storm came, I saw them scatter, then regroup, then leave, but one was missing." Margaret absorbed this. "You counted." Always the single word carried the weight of hard-learned survival wisdom. They reached what must be the cabin, though Margaret's outstretched hands encountered rough-hewn logs rather than the stone walls she had expected. Running Elk guided her to the entrance. "Wait here," he instructed, releasing her wrist. She heard him move ahead, the shuffle of what might have been kindling or firewood, the strike of flint against steel, and then the unmistakable crackling of a fire catching. The sudden warmth against her face felt like a blessing. Margaret closed her eyes instinctively, though it made no difference to her perception, a habit from her sighted days that she had never broken. "Come," Running Elk said. "Sit by the fire." He guided her to a spot where the heat was strongest, helping her settle on what felt like a roughly made bench or stool. The fragrance of pine and sage filled the small space. "Your clothes are wet," Running Elk said matter-of-factly. "They must dry or you will sicken. I will turn away. There is a blanket of rabbit fur beside you." Margaret's hand found the soft pelt he described. "Thank you," she managed, the propriety of her upbringing warring with practical necessity. She heard him move to the cabin entrance, felt the slight shift in the air as he turned his back to her. With cold, clumsy fingers, she began to unlace her sodden dress, pride giving way to the desperate need for warmth and survival. As she wrapped the fur around her shoulders, feeling its surprising softness against her skin, Margaret realized she had passed into a world where the rules and judgments of her former life no longer applied. Here, in this cabin, with this stranger, who had saved her without obligation, she existed in a space between her past and whatever uncertain future awaited her. And somehow, despite everything, She found herself drawing her first free breath in years. Before we continue with Margaret and Running Elk's story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this tale of survival against the odds resonates with you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we're sharing an equally powerful story of unexpected kindness that changed the course of history. Now, back to the Colorado mountains of 1877. Morning arrived with subtle shifts, the chirping of birds replacing night insects, the cabin warming as sunlight reached its entrance. Margaret woke disoriented, her hands instinctively seeking familiar surroundings and finding only the strange texture of rabbit fur and a wooden floor. Memory flooded back. The storm, the abandonment, the Kiowa scout who had saved her. She sat up quickly, clutching the fur around her shoulders. "Your clothes are dry." Running Elk's voice came from across the cabin, respectfully distant. "I have placed them beside you. There is water in a wooden cup to your right." Margaret's fingers found the rough-hewn cup, bringing it gratefully to her lips. The water was cool and fresh, washing away the sour taste of sleep and fear. "Thank you," she said, setting down the empty cup. Could you step outside while I dress?" "I am already outside," came the reply, a hint of amusement in his tone. "Call when you are ready." Left alone, Margaret felt for her clothes, finding them neatly folded beside her sleeping place. The fabric was still slightly damp in the deepest folds, but worlds better than the soaking garments she had removed the night before. Her fingers traced a tear in the sleeve she hadn't noticed previously, likely caught on a branch during their hasty journey through the forest. As she dressed, her mind churned with uncertainties. What would happen now? The caravan was gone, continuing towards Silver Creek without her. Even if Running Elk helped her reach the settlement, what awaited her there? No family, no funds, no prospects, just the same pity and burden she had endured. "With the Holloways. I am dressed," she called when she had finished smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly from more than just the morning chill. Running Elk's footsteps entered the cabin, accompanied by a new scent, something earthy and rich. "Food," he explained, sensing her alertness. "Dried venison and pine nuts." He placed something in her hands, a flat piece of bark that served as a plate. Margaret felt its contents carefully, strips of jerky and what felt like small, teardrop-shaped nuts. "The nuts grow in pine cones," Running Elk explained. "Good food when traveling without cook-fire." Margaret bit into one tentatively. It had a mild, slightly sweet flavor, surprisingly satisfying. The venison was tough, but smoky and sustaining. She realized suddenly how famished she was, having eaten nothing since the previous morning. "You hunt alone?" she asked between bites, trying to piece together an understanding of this man who had saved her life. When necessary, his answer was typically economical. She heard him moving about the small cabin, gathering things, preparations of some kind underway. "What will you do with me?" Margaret finally asked, the question that had hovered in her mind since waking. Running Elk paused in his activities. "That depends on what you wish, Margaret Holloway." The use of her full name startled her. She had almost forgotten she had told him. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, the stark truth of it settling heavily between them. "Silver Creek is at least 2 days' travel, and I have no money, no family waiting." "Then why did you join the caravan west?" Running Elk asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Margaret's fingers tightened around the bark plate. I had no choice. After my husband died at Antietam, I lived on his military pension. When my eyesight failed, Richard convinced me to sign over my pension rights to fund his mining venture. He promised I'd have a share worth far more. She gave a bitter laugh. A blind woman has few options in this world. Silence followed her words. Then Running Elk spoke, his voice closer than before. The Kiowa do not cast aside those who cannot see with their eyes. Such people often see more clearly with their spirits. He took the empty bark plate from her hands. You have choices now that you did not have yesterday. You can try to reach Silver Creek alone. I will point the way if that is your wish. I can guide you there myself, which would take 2 days of travel. Or, Margaret prompted when he didn't continue. Or you can remain here for a time. Learn to survive in this place. Then decide your path when you are stronger. The offer stunned her. Why would you do that? Why help me at all? Running Elk was quiet for a moment. When I was a boy, my grandmother lost her sight in her final years. She was not abandoned. She was honored. Her wisdom sought even more than before. What your people did. He stopped abruptly. It is not our way. The simplicity of his explanation humbled her. No grand declarations of chivalry or Christian charity, just a fundamental difference in how his people viewed worth and obligation. I would stay, Margaret said before she could reconsider, at least until I can be less of a burden. Then we begin today, Running Elk replied, and she could hear the nod in his voice. First lesson, the cabin and the land around it. What followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced since losing her sight. Instead of being protected from knowledge of her surroundings, guided everywhere with minimal explanation, seated and left in corners, treated as fragile and incapable, Running Elk methodically helped her map the world immediately available to her. He led her through the cabin, allowing her to touch the walls, teaching her to count steps between important features. 4 steps from sleeping mat to fire circle, 6 steps from fire to cabin entrance, 3 steps right of entrance to water storage. Outside, he oriented her to the sun's warmth on her face. When you feel morning sun directly, you face east. Cabin opening faces southeast. Stream lies west and downhill. He placed a sturdy walking stick in her hands, showing her how to use it to detect obstacles before her feet found them. Sweep in a small arc before each step. Listen to the sound it makes against different surfaces. Throughout the morning, Margaret concentrated intently, committing each detail to memory, determined to prove herself capable. By midday, she could navigate from her sleeping place to the cabin entrance without assistance. It was a small victory, but one that filled her with quiet pride. You learn quickly, Running Elk observed, as they shared a midday meal of dried berries he had gathered. I've had 3 years to practice remembering what I cannot see, Margaret replied, though no one before has taken the time to teach me properly. The ones who left you, they treated you as if your ears and mind were as blind as your eyes, Running Elk said, cutting to the heart of how the Holloways had handled her disability. Margaret couldn't deny it. They meant well, I suppose, at least at first. But I became a problem to be managed, not a person to be helped. That is their failing, not yours, Running Elk said simply. The afternoon brought new lessons. Running Elk taught her to identify different trees by their bark texture and scent, how to tell which direction water flowed by its sound, how to recognize when animals were nearby by their movements through underbrush. Tonight, we will make a better sleeping place, he explained as they returned to the cabin. I will show you how to arrange pine boughs for comfort." As the sun began to set, a change Margaret perceived through the cooling air and subtle shift in forest sounds. Running Elk built up the fire. The pleasant crackling and increased warmth signaled dinner preparations. "Your hands," Running Elk said unexpectedly. "Show them to me." Puzzled, Margaret held them out. His fingers gently examined hers, turning them palm up. "Soft," he observed. "Not used to work." Heat crept into her cheeks. "I wasn't permitted to do much. Sarah feared I would break things or hurt myself." "These hands must become stronger," he said matter-of-factly. "Tomorrow we begin with small tasks: weaving, fire building, food preparation." "You believe I can do these things?" Margaret couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice, years of enforced helplessness having taken their toll on her confidence. "I know you can," Running Elk replied with quiet certainty. "Blindness is not weakness, Margaret Holloway. It is simply a different way of moving through the world." That night, as she lay on her sleeping mat listening to the gentle pop and hiss of the dying fire, Margaret turned his words over in her mind. Different, not lesser; capable, not helpless. The possibility unfurled within her like a tightly closed flower sensing its first spring sunlight. For the first time since losing her sight, someone looked at her and saw potential instead of burden. The revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sleep came slowly, her mind too active with plans and possibilities for the days ahead. Just before consciousness slipped away, a sudden realization jolted through her. She had not once today wished to be found by the Holloways or the caravan. Whatever uncertain future lay before her, Margaret Holloway had already taken her first step toward freedom, not despite her blindness, but with it as simply another facet of who she was. Days melted into one another as Margaret settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable in her previous life. Each morning began with Running Elk's quiet voice rousing her from sleep, followed by simple but nourishing meals and tasks designed to strengthen both her body and her confidence. On the fifth day, rain returned, gentler than the storm that had stranded her, but persistent enough to keep them largely confined to the cabin. The constant patter against the logs created a soothing rhythm that Margaret found herself unconsciously matching as she worked on weaving a small basket from river reeds Running Elk had collected the previous day. "Your fingers are learning the patterns," Running Elk observed as he sat nearby, fashioning new arrowheads from stone with methodical precision. The soft scraping sound provided a counterpoint to her weaving. Margaret paused, running her fingers over her work. The basket was crude compared to what Running Elk could produce, but the reeds bent to her will more readily than they had when she first attempted the skill. "I've never created anything useful before," she admitted. "In my husband's home, I played piano and embroidered decorative things. After losing my sight, I wasn't trusted to do even that much." Running Elk made a non-committal sound, neither judgment nor pity. "Different skills for different worlds. Here, what you make keeps you alive." A sudden gust of wind drove rain into the cabin entrance, bringing with it the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. Margaret lifted her face toward the cooler air, inhaling deeply. "The rain smells different here than in Virginia," she observed. "Wilder, somehow." "You are learning to read the world through senses beyond sight," Running Elk said, approval warming his typically measured tone. "What else do you notice?" Margaret closed her eyes, a habit from her sighted days that helped her concentrate. The birds are quiet now, but they'll sing when the rain stops. The stream runs faster today. I can hear the difference in its voice." She hesitated, uncertain of this last observation. "Speak," Running Elk encouraged. "There's tension in the air, a heaviness that wasn't there yesterday." Running Elk set down his work, the stone scraper falling silent. "Good. You sense the changing pressure. Storm's not finished. Bigger weather comes." Margaret's hand stilled on her basket. "Like the one that separated me from the caravan." "Perhaps. Nature speaks warnings to those who listen." Running Elk moved toward the cabin entrance. She could hear him arranging something, additional protection against the coming weather, she guessed. "Will we be safe here?" she asked, a flutter of anxiety stirring in her chest. "Cabin has stood through many seasons," Running Elk replied, "but we prepare. First rule of survival, respect what you cannot control." Throughout the afternoon, they worked to secure their shelter. Running Elk guided Margaret's hands as they piled stones to divert water from the entrance, arranged their supplies higher against the cabin walls, and gathered additional firewood while it was still relatively dry. As evening approached, the wind intensified, howling through the trees with increasing ferocity. The temperature dropped sharply, and Running Elk built the fire higher than usual. "Cold comes with this storm," he explained, as he placed a warm cup of pine needle tea in Margaret's hands. "Drink. It will help keep sickness away." The tea was bitter but not unpleasant, with a resinous fragrance that reminded her of Christmas. As she sipped, Margaret realized how much her perception of comfort had changed in less than a week. The hard wooden floor covered with pine boughs, the simple fare, the close quarters with a man who had been a stranger days ago, all would have horrified her former self. Now they represented safety and survival. "You're quiet," Running Elk observed. After a time, Margaret cradled his philosophy was so different from the complex social rules that had governed Margaret's life. Simpler, more direct, yet containing profound truth. The storm intensified as night fell fully. Rain lashed at the cabin entrance and wind shrieked through the forest beyond. Occasional crashes indicated falling branches or trees succumbing to the gale. Running Elk added more wood to the fire. "Sleep may be difficult tonight," he warned. "Storm speaks loudly." Margaret wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, unable to suppress a shiver that wasn't entirely from cold. "It sounds angry." "Nature is not angry or kind," Running Elk replied. "It simply is. Human minds seek meaning in what has no meaning." A particularly violent gust sent embers swirling from the fire, accompanied by the distant crack of splitting wood. Running Elk moved quickly to stamp out any stray sparks. "That was close," Margaret said, her heart beating faster. "Yes. We should—" Running Elk stopped abruptly, his sudden silence more alarming than any words. "What is it?" Margaret asked, tension coiling in her stomach. "Listen," he instructed, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Margaret strained, her ears past the storm's chaos. At first she heard nothing unusual. Then a low, rumbling growl emanated from near the cabin entrance. The sound raised the hair on her arms. "Mountain lion!" Running Elk breathed so quietly she almost didn't hear him, seeking shelter from the storm. Fear clutched at Margaret's throat, nearly choking her. "What do we do?" she whispered back. "Be still. Fire will keep it at the entrance." "Most times they avoid humans." "Most times?" The qualifier hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Margaret heard Running Elk moving with deliberate slowness. The soft scrape of metal suggested he was retrieving his knife, or perhaps the small axe he used for chopping wood. The growl came again, louder this time. Margaret could picture the creature: tawny fur, powerful shoulders, eyes gleaming in the firelight. She had seen one once, years ago, in a traveling exhibition. Even in captivity, it had radiated lethal grace. "If it comes closer," Running Elk murmured, "move behind me. Slowly." Margaret nodded, belatedly realizing he might not see the gesture. In the dimness, "Yes," she whispered. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The mountain lion paced at the cabin entrance, occasionally growling or making strange, plaintive cries that sounded eerily human. The storm continued unabated, likely driving the predator to seek any available shelter. Running Elk remained vigilant, periodically adding wood to the fire to maintain a bright barrier between them and the big cat. Margaret sat perfectly still, hands clenched in her lap, every sense heightened by fear. "It's moving closer," she whispered. Suddenly, certain despite her blindness, she could feel the animal's presence, a shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Now," Running Elk said quietly, "behind me." Margaret slid backward, careful not to make sudden movements. Her hand found Running Elk's shoulder as he positioned himself between her and the threat. She could feel the tense readiness in his muscles. Snarl ripped through the cabin, followed by the distinct sound of padded paws on wood. The mountain lion had entered their shelter. Running Elk spoke suddenly, not in English but in Kiowa, his voice low but commanding. The words meant nothing to Margaret, but the tone conveyed clear warning. The big cat growled in response. Margaret could smell it now, a musky, wild scent overlaid with the sharper smell of wet fur. Running Elk shifted slightly, and she heard the rasp of metal, his hunting knife being drawn. He spoke again, the strange syllables rolling from his tongue with quiet authority. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The mountain lion roared, a sound so primal and powerful that Margaret felt it in her bones. Running Elk surged forward with explosive energy. There was a confusion of sounds, snarling, the scuffle of movement, a pained grunt from Running Elk that sent Margaret's heart into her throat, then a final, terrible yowl from the mountain lion, followed by the heavy thud of a large body hitting the cabin floor. Silence descended, broken only by Running Elk's labored breathing and the continuing rage of the storm outside. "Running Elk," Margaret called anxiously. "Are you hurt?" "Scratched," he replied, his voice strained. "Not serious?" She heard him moving, dragging something heavy. "The cat?" "Dead," he confirmed. "It will provide food and fur when storm passes." Margaret released a shuddering breath. "You saved my life again." "We saved each other," Running Elk corrected. "Your warning gave me time to prepare." He returned to her side, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers finding his arm. Warm wetness met her touch. "You're bleeding," she said with alarm. "Small wounds," Running Elk insisted, though his voice betrayed pain he wouldn't otherwise acknowledge. "Need cleaning." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Tell me what to do." For once, Running Elk didn't object to her help. "Water in the small pot by the fire, clean cloth in my bundle." With careful movements, Margaret located the items. "Guide my hands," she requested. Running Elk directed her as she cleaned his wounds. 3 deep scratches across his forearm, where the mountain lion's claws had found their mark. The injuries weren't life-threatening, but they clearly caused significant pain. Plants in a leather pouch, Running Elk instructed. Crushed yarrow leaves. Apply to cuts. Margaret followed his instructions, her touch gentle but sure as she dressed. His wounds. A profound role reversal settled over her. For the first time, Running Elk needed her help, not the other way around. "You did well," Running Elk said when she had finished bandaging his arm. "Steady hands. I've had practice," Margaret replied, allowing a small smile. 3 years of learning to do everything by touch. As they settled back beside the fire, the storm still raging outside, but the more immediate danger past, Margaret felt a curious sense of accomplishment mingled with lingering fear. "Will there be more?" she asked. "Mountain lions?" "Not likely," Running Elk assured her. "They hunt alone, claim large territories." He paused. "But wilderness holds many dangers, some with claws, some with guns." His words reminded Margaret that they existed in a precarious space, not just between civilization and wilderness, but between two colliding worlds with long histories of violence and mistrust. "Is that why you live alone?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. Running Elk was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of painful memory. "I have walked too long between worlds to belong fully to either." In that simple statement, Margaret heard echoes of her own isolation, different in cause but perhaps similar. In effect, both of them existed on the margins, navigating boundaries others took for granted. The storm outside began to abate, the wind's howl softening to a moan. The immediate dangers had passed, but as Margaret drifted toward exhausted sleep, Running Elk's words lingered in her mind. The wilderness had teeth and claws, yes, but so did the world of men, and she was no longer certain which presented the greater threat. The morning after the mountain lion attack dawned clear and cold. Margaret woke to the unfamiliar weight of a new fur across her sleeping mat, the pelt of the great cat, carefully cleaned and prepared while she slept. "You were busy last night," she observed, running her fingers through the surprisingly soft fur. "Waste nothing," Running Elk replied simply. "The cat gives us warmth, meat, and tools. Its spirit deserves respect." Over breakfast, roasted mountain lion meat that tasted gamey but satisfying, Running Elk announced their plans for the day. "Today we leave the cabin," he said. "You must learn the surrounding land." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. "Is your arm well enough?" The scratches had been deep, the bandaging extensive. "It will heal," Running Elk replied, dismissing his injury with characteristic stoicism. "Knowledge of the land cannot wait. Storm has passed, but winter approaches." The implications were clear. Her survival depended on expanding her understanding beyond their immediate shelter. Outside, the air held the crisp clarity that follows major storms. Margaret inhaled deeply, detecting subtle changes in the forest, fresher scents where rain had washed away dust, the sharp tang of broken pine branches, the earthy perfume of mushrooms suddenly sprouting in dampened soil. "Take your walking stick," Running Elk instructed. "Today we make a map you can carry here." He tapped her forehead gently. What followed was unlike any lesson Margaret had experienced. Running Elk guided her in expanding circles outward from the cabin, teaching her to identify landmarks through touch, sound, and scent. He showed her how sloping ground always indicated direction, how the sun's warmth on her face oriented her, how streams and animal paths created navigation lines through the wilderness. "The forest speaks constantly," he explained as they paused beside a fallen oak. Wind through pine needles sounds different than through oak leaves. Morning birds sing in different locations than evening birds. Deer paths run east-west. Creek flows to the river southward. Margaret absorbed these lessons eagerly, constructing a mental map far more complex than she would have believed possible days earlier. When Running Elk unexpectedly stepped away, telling her to find her own path back to the cabin, anxiety surged briefly before determination took its place. She stood still, orienting herself. The sun's warmth fell on her right cheek. West, then. The ground sloped subtly downward toward the stream, north. That meant the cabin lay southeast. Margaret tapped her walking stick against the ground, finding the barely perceptible deer trail Running Elk had shown her earlier. She followed it confidently, counting steps under her breath. At a distinctive rock formation, a jutting stone shelf she had learned to recognize by touch, she turned eastward, following the sound of wind through a stand of young pines. 23 steps later, her stick detected the slight depression that marked the final approach to the cabin. "I've returned," she called, unable to keep pride from her voice. Running Elk's answering footsteps emerged from inside the cabin. "You found the way without hesitation," he observed. "Faster than yesterday." "Yesterday?" Margaret questioned, momentarily confused. A rare chuckle escaped Running Elk. "You thought that was the first time I left you to find your own path. I have watched over you each day, stepping aside to let you navigate alone. Today is simply the first time I told you of it." Margaret wasn't sure whether to feel indignant or grateful. "You've been testing me?" "Teaching you," Running Elk corrected. "Confidence comes from doing, not from being told you can do." His words struck her deeply. How different from the anxious hovering of the Holloways, their constant reminders of her limitations, their insistence on protecting her from even the possibility of self-sufficiency. "Thank you," she said finally, "for believing I could before I knew it myself." The afternoon brought new challenges. Running Elk taught her to identify edible plants by smell and texture. The distinctive serrated edges of raspberry leaves, the smooth coolness of wild onion bulbs, the fuzzy stems of mint. "Winter comes soon," he reminded her. "Plants sleep. We must harvest what remains and store knowledge for spring's return." As they worked, Margaret sensed a subtle shift in Running Elk's demeanor, a new urgency underlying his calm instruction. She paused in gathering the last of the wild blackberries, her fingers stained with purple juice. "You're worried about something," she observed. It wasn't a question. Running Elk fell silent, his hesitation uncharacteristic. "Word will have reached the Kiowa camps about the white woman in my care," he said finally. "Questions will come. Perhaps trouble." Margaret's hand stilled on the berries. Her presence complicated Running Elk's already precarious position between two worlds. "I should leave," she said, the words painful but necessary. "Go to Silver Creek as planned." "Could you survive the journey?" Running Elk asked, not unkindly. They both knew the answer. Despite her rapid progress, Margaret was nowhere near capable of navigating 2 days of difficult terrain alone. "I don't want to bring you trouble," she said softly. "Trouble finds all paths eventually," Running Elk replied. "Better to face it prepared." They returned to the cabin as evening approached. Margaret's basket heavy with foraged foods. Running Elk had been quieter than usual during their walk back, his thoughts clearly occupied by concerns he hadn't fully shared. As they prepared their evening meal, Margaret found herself hyper-aware of his movements, the careful precision as he sliced dried meat, the gentle tap of his knife against stone as he worked. She realized with sudden clarity how much his presence had come to mean to her, more than safety or survival knowledge. Running Elk offered something she had missed since losing her sight, respect for her capacity to adapt and learn. "I've been thinking," Running Elk said unexpectedly as they sat beside the fire. "Tomorrow we begin new lessons." "What kind of lessons?" Margaret asked, curiosity piqued. "How to listen to what cannot be heard," he replied. "The Kiowa believe. Those without sight often see more clearly with the spirit. My grandmother had this gift in her blindness." Margaret remained silent, unsure how to respond. In her Virginia upbringing, talk of spirits and unseen worlds belonged to Sunday sermons, not practical daily life. "You doubt," Running Elk observed, no judgment in his voice. "I don't know what to believe anymore," Margaret admitted. "Everything I was taught seems distant now, like stories told to a child." Running Elk added wood to the fire, the crackle of new flames filling the silence between them. "When eyes close, other paths open, but only for those willing to walk them." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "It means you must decide if you trust only what others have told you, or if you will discover truths for yourself." The simplicity of his statement contained depths she couldn't yet fathom. That night, as Margaret lay on her sleeping mat, the mountain lion's pelt providing unexpected comfort, she contemplated Running Elk's words. Her world had contracted dramatically when blindness took her sight, boundaries imposed by others' perceptions of her capabilities, her own fears, the physical limitations of navigating without vision. Yet here, paradoxically, finally, Running Elk switched to English. "Margaret, these are people from my tribe. Black Feather, a warrior chief, his son Standing Bear, and Singing Bird, a medicine woman." "Greetings," Margaret said, inclining her head toward where the voices had come from. "Thank you for the hospitality of your land." A woman's voice responded, older and authoritative, with an accent thicker than Running Elk's. "You are the blind one he shelters. Word has traveled to our camp." "Yes," Margaret confirmed simply. "Running Elk saved my life when my people abandoned me." A male voice, younger, harder-edged, spoke next. "Mawissa has always walked strange paths. A blind white woman may be his strangest yet. Standing Bear," the woman Singing Bird admonished sharply. "You forget your manners when your caution speaks too loudly." "There is nothing to forgive," Margaret replied carefully. "Caution is wise in uncertain times." Her response seemed to surprise them. A brief conversation in Kiowa followed, too rapid for Margaret to detect any meaning from the tones. Running Elk spoke again. "They have come with news and to see for themselves who shelters with me." "Is the news good or ill?" Margaret asked. Another silence followed, heavy with unspoken communications. "Both," Singing Bird answered finally. "Army soldiers have come to Fort Carson. They speak of escalating troubles with the Ute to the west. They also search for missing settlers." Margaret's heart skipped. "My caravan, perhaps?" the older woman confirmed. "They offer payment for information about a blind woman lost in a storm." The revelation landed like a physical blow. The Holloways were looking for her after deliberately leaving her behind. But why? "The soldiers bring trouble for the Kiowa," Standing Bear stated flatly. "Your presence here could bring more." Running Elk responded in Kiowa, his tone firm but respectful. The conversation continued in their language, occasionally rising in intensity before settling again. Margaret remained silent, understanding that her fate was being discussed, but unable to influence the outcome. Finally, Running Elk addressed her in English. "The council wishes to meet. Blackfeather suggests you come to our camp until this matter is resolved." Fear and uncertainty flooded Margaret's mind. The camp would mean strangers, unfamiliar surroundings, potential hostility, yet refusing could place Running Elk in an impossible position between his people and his choice to help her. "Would I be welcomed there?" she asked directly. "You would be safe," Singing Bird replied, sidestepping the question of welcome. "And we could learn what these soldiers truly seek." Margaret squared her shoulders. "When must we leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Running Elk answered. "Tonight, they will share our fire and food." What followed was one of the strangest evenings of Margaret's life. As Running Elk and their visitors prepared a meal, conversation flowed around her, sometimes in English, often in Kiowa. She listened intently, gathering impressions of each visitor through their voices, movements, and interactions. Blackfeather carried authority wrapped in wisdom, his questions direct but never unkind. Singing Bird moved with a deliberate grace that Margaret could sense even without sight. Standing Bear remained suspicious, his occasional English comments clipped and guarded as they ate roasted rabbit and foraged roots. Singing Bird unexpectedly addressed Margaret directly. "Running Elk says you learn quickly the ways of forest survival." "I have an excellent teacher," Margaret replied, "and perhaps more reason than most to listen carefully to his lessons." "Tell me," the older woman continued, "what did you dream about last night?" The question seemed odd, disconnected. From their previous conversation, Margaret hesitated. "Dreams speak truths the waking mind cannot hear," Singing Bird explained, "especially for those whose eyes see darkness." Margaret considered carefully before answering. "I dreamed of water, a river wider than any I've known, with two paths leading, and from its banks I stood between them, unable to choose which to follow." A loaded silence followed her words. Then Singing Bird made a soft sound of interest. "The river of decision," she said. "You stand at its edge now, blind one. Soon you must choose your path." As night deepened around them, and their visitors settled into sleep near the fire, Margaret pondered the medicine woman's words. What choice awaited her? Between returning to the settlers or remaining with the Kiowa? Between her past life and whatever uncertain future might unfold here? Tomorrow would bring a journey to the camp, and perhaps answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. Dawn arrived with a thin veil of mist clinging to the forest floor. Margaret woke to the sounds of quiet preparation, the soft murmur of voices speaking Kiowa, the rustle of belongings being gathered, the distinctive scrape of Running Elk's knife against stone as he sharpened it one final time. "We leave soon," he told her, placing a small bundle beside her sleeping mat. "These are for you, moccasins, better for the journey than your boots." Margaret ran her fingers over the supple deerskin, feeling the careful stitching and delicate beadwork along the edges. "They're beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "Did you make these?" "Singing Bird," Running Elk replied. "She worked through the night. She says your feet have learned enough of the land to deserve proper covering." The medicine woman's gesture moved Margaret deeply, despite whatever misgivings the Kiowa might harbor about her presence. This small kindness offered a glimmer of potential acceptance. Breakfast was hurried, dried meat and a warm tea that tasted of mint and something earthier Margaret couldn't identify. As they prepared to depart, Running Elk guided her through a final inspection of the cabin. "We may not return," he explained, helping her gather the few possessions she had accumulated. "Take what you can carry easily." The realization that she might never come back to this place struck Margaret with surprising force. The cabin had become her first true sanctuary since losing her sight, a place where she'd begun to reclaim her independence, to redefine her capabilities beyond the limiting expectations of others. "I'm ready," she said finally, slinging a small leather pouch containing her husband's pocket watch, the mountain lion pelt Running Elk had given her, and a few other essential items across her body. The journey began with little ceremony. Margaret walked between Running Elk and Singing Bird, with Blackfeather leading and Standing Bear following behind. The pace was steady but not hurried, accommodating her need to navigate carefully with her walking stick. "You would be safe," Singing Bird replied, sidestepping the question of welcome, "and we could learn what these soldiers truly seek." Margaret squared her shoulders. "When must we leave?" "Tomorrow at dawn," Running Elk answered. "Tonight they will share our fire and food." What followed was one of the strangest evenings of Margaret's life. As Running Elk and their visitors prepared a meal, conversation flowed around her, sometimes in English, often in Kiowa. She listened intently, gathering impressions of each visitor through their voices, movements, and interactions. Blackfeather carried authority wrapped in wisdom, his questions direct but never unkind. Singing Bird moved with a deliberate grace that Margaret could sense even without sight. Standing Bear remained suspicious, his occasional English comments clipped and guarded. As they ate roasted rabbit and foraged roots, Singing Bird unexpectedly addressed Margaret directly. "Running Elk says you learn quickly the ways of forest, survival." "I have an excellent teacher," Margaret replied, "and perhaps more reason than most to listen carefully to his lessons." "Tell me," the older woman continued, "what did you dream about last night?" The question seemed odd, disconnected. From their previous conversation, Margaret hesitated. "Dreams speak truths the waking mind cannot hear," Singing Bird explained, "especially for those whose eyes see darkness." Margaret considered carefully before answering. "I dreamed of water, a river wider than any I've known, with two paths leading. From its banks, I stood between them, unable to choose which to follow." A loaded silence followed her words. Then Singing Bird made a soft sound of interest. "The river of decision," she said. "You stand at its edge now, blind one. Soon you must choose your path." As night deepened around them, and their visitors settled into sleep near the fire, Margaret pondered the medicine woman's words. What choice awaited her? Between returning to the settlers or remaining with the Kiowa? Between her past life and whatever uncertain future might unfold here? Tomorrow would bring a journey to the camp, and perhaps answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. Dawn arrived with a thin veil of mist clinging to the forest floor. Margaret woke to the sounds of quiet preparation, the soft murmur of voices speaking Kiowa, the rustle of belongings being gathered, the distinctive scrape of Running Elk's knife against stone as he sharpened it one final time. "We leave soon," he told her, placing a small bundle beside her sleeping mat. "These are for you. Moccasins, better for the journey than your boots." Margaret ran her fingers over the supple deerskin, feeling the careful stitching and delicate beadwork along the edges. "They're beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gift. "Did you make these?" "Singing bird," Running Elk replied. "She worked through the night. She says your feet have learned enough of the land to deserve proper covering." The medicine woman's gesture moved Margaret deeply, despite whatever misgivings the Kiowa might harbor about her presence. This small kindness offered a glimmer of potential acceptance. Breakfast was hurried. Dried meat and a warm tea that tasted of mint and something earthier Margaret couldn't identify. As they prepared to depart, Running Elk guided her through a final inspection of the cabin. "We may not return," he explained, helping her gather the few possessions she had accumulated. "Take what you can carry easily." The realization that she might never come back to this place struck Margaret with surprising force. The cabin had become her first true sanctuary since losing her sight, a place where she'd begun to reclaim her independence, to redefine her capabilities beyond the limiting expectations of others. "I'm ready," she said finally, slinging a small leather pouch containing her husband's pocket watch, the mountain lion pelt Running Elk had given her, and a few other essential items across her body. The journey began with little ceremony. Margaret walked between Running Elk and Singing Bird, with Blackfeather leading and Standing Bear following behind. The pace was steady, but not hurried, accommodating her need to navigate carefully with her walking stick. "Circle," Running Elk ordered quietly. Margaret in the center, the group rearranged swiftly, forming a protective ring around her. Margaret clutched her walking stick, knowing it would provide little defense, but unwilling to stand entirely helpless. "They do not usually hunt humans," Blackfeather observed, his voice betraying confusion. "Something drives them to desperation," Standing Bear added grimly. "Or someone." Another growl, closer now. Margaret could hear the soft padding of paws. Circling their position, the occasional snap of jaws. Running Elk spoke quietly in Kiowa, a prayer or perhaps a chant, the words flowing with rhythmic intensity. To Margaret's surprise, Singing Bird joined him, their voices twining together in ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The wolves' movements changed, still circling, but more hesitant, less coordinated. A high-pitched whine rose from one, answered by confused growls from the others. "They are uncertain now," Singing Bird murmured to Margaret. "The old words remind them of the time when wolf and human spoke the same language." Margaret wasn't sure whether to believe such things were possible, but the effect was undeniable. The wolves' aggressive stance was wavering. Blackfeather seized the moment, striking flint to steel and creating a sudden shower of sparks that ignited a handful of dried pine needles he had prepared. The small flame cast dancing shadows through the trees. "Fire," he announced, feeding the flame until it grew stronger. "Now we make our stand." The wolves retreated further from the firelight, their growls diminishing. Margaret felt the tension in their circle ease slightly, though no one relaxed their vigilance. "We cannot stay here," Standing Bear pointed out. "Night comes and the camp is still far." "We make torches," Running Elk decided. "Continue with fire." Working quickly, the group fashioned crude torches from pine branches, wrapping them with resin-soaked bark that caught the flames eagerly. Margaret was given a smaller branch, its end glowing hot, not to carry, but to hold ready if needed. They set off again, movement slower but steadier. The wolves kept pace at a distance, but no longer closing in. Margaret could hear them tracking parallel to their path, occasionally growling or whining to each other. "They are being driven," Singing Bird said quietly, walking close beside Margaret now. "Something compels them against their nature." "What could make wolves behave this way?" Margaret asked, clutching her firebrand tightly. The old woman was silent for several steps before answering. "There are those among both your people and mine who know the old ways of controlling animals, dark medicine." The implication chilled Margaret more than the approaching evening air. "Someone is deliberately targeting us." "Perhaps," Singing Bird. Aloud. "Or perhaps it is as Blackfeather says, hunger drives them to unusual behavior." But her tone suggested she believed the former explanation, not the latter. As darkness began to fall in earnest, their torches became their primary defense and guidance. Margaret walked carefully, hyper-aware of every sound around them, the wolves' presence a constant reminder of hovering danger. "Listen," Running Elk said suddenly, his voice lifting with cautious hope. Margaret strained her ears and caught it, a faint but steady rhythm carried on the evening breeze. "Drums," Singing Bird explained. "We are closer than I thought." The wolves seemed to hear it too. Their tracking sounds receded gradually until Standing Bear confirmed they had departed altogether. Relief washed through the group, though no one lowered their guard completely. They pressed forward with renewed energy, the distant drums growing steadily louder, guiding them home. For Margaret, those drum beats represented an unknown future, a Kiowa camp where she would be an outsider, a curiosity, perhaps even a threat. Yet after facing wolves and wilderness, after being abandoned by her own people, the prospect of reaching human settlement, any settlement, filled her with determined hope. The real test of survival, she was beginning to understand, would not be in the forest, but in what awaited her beyond it. The drums grew louder as they approached, accompanied now by the sound of voices, the bark of dogs, and the subtle but unmistakable energy of a community preparing for evening. Margaret felt the path change beneath her feet, from forest floor to a more traveled trail, packed firm by countless footsteps. "Many will stare," Running Elk warned her quietly. "Few have seen white woman who walks in darkness." "I'm accustomed to stares I cannot see," Margaret replied, straightening her shoulders, "though I admit being curious among the Kiowa was not something I ever imagined." "Be respectful but not fearful," Singing Bird advised from her other side. "Our people value strength in adversity." The sounds of the camp suddenly enveloped them as they crossed some invisible boundary. The drumming paused briefly, then resumed at a different tempo. Voices hushed momentarily before erupting in questions. Children called out excitedly. Adults spoke in rapid Kiowa that Margaret couldn't hope to follow. Running Elk kept a steadying hand at her elbow as they moved deeper into the camp. The rich tapestry of scents overwhelmed Margaret's senses. Wood smoke, cooking meat, unfamiliar herbs, tanned hides, and the distinctive smell of many humans living in close proximity. "The council lodge lies ahead," Running Elk murmured. "The elders will wish to speak with us immediately." Margaret nodded, her throat too dry for words, the weight of dozens of unseen eyes pressing against her. A new voice, elderly, male, carrying natural authority, spoke in Kiowa. Running Elk answered respectfully, his hand tightening slightly on Margaret's arm. "Chief Grey Wolf wishes to know why we bring a blind settler woman to our camp during troubled times," Running Elk translated, keeping his voice low. Before Margaret could respond, Singing Bird stepped forward, speaking at length in Kiowa. Though Margaret couldn't understand the words, She recognized the medicine woman was advocating for her, the tone both respectful and insistent. "Come," Running Elk said when Singing Bird finished. "We go to the council now." They were led to a large, circular structure. Margaret could tell by the way sounds echoed within it and the distinctive smell of old smoke preserved in wooden beams. She was guided to sit on what felt like a woven mat, Running Elk taking position beside her. What followed was unlike anything in Margaret's experience. The formal council unfolded primarily in Kiowa, with Running Elk occasionally translating key points in whispered English. Chief Grey Wolf spoke first, his deep voice resonating with measured dignity. Then Blackfeather recounted their journey, the wolf encounter drawing murmurs of concern from the gathered elders. When Standing Bear mentioned the soldiers at Fort Carson searching for a blind woman, the council's atmosphere tensed noticeably. Finally, Running Elk was called to speak. He explained how he had found Margaret abandoned during the storm, his decision to help her, and the skills she had shown in adapting to forest life. His tone remained factual, neither defending nor apologizing for his actions. A period of questions followed, some directed at Running Elk, others at Margaret. She sat quietly, understanding that to interrupt would be seen as disrespectful. Yet as the discussion continued entirely in Kiowa, her patience began to fray. "Running Elk," she whispered finally, "they are deciding my fate. Should I not speak? For myself?" A ripple of reaction told her the council had heard and understood her English words. Running Elk hesitated, clearly caught between protocols. To Margaret's surprise, it was Chief Grey Wolf who responded, speaking in clear, if accented, English. "The blind one wishes to speak. We will hear her words." Margaret turned her face toward his voice, gathering her thoughts carefully. "Honorable Chief and Council, I come before you not by choice, but by circumstance. My own people abandoned me to die. Running Elk showed me kindness when my blood kin did not." She paused, then continued with growing confidence. "I have learned much from him, how to hear the forest speak, how to find my way without eyes, how to value what truly matters. I understand my presence brings complications. If you wish me to leave, I will do so, though I ask for guidance to reach safe haven." She squared her shoulders. "But know this, I have no desire to return to those who left me to die, nor to bring soldiers to your doors. I seek only to find a place where I might live with dignity despite my blindness." A long silence followed her words. Then Chief Grey Wolf spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You speak with an honest heart, Blind One, but these are dangerous times between our peoples. Treaties made are treaties broken. Kiowa land shrinks with each season. Your presence here may bring unwanted attention." "I understand," Margaret acknowledged. "What would you have me do?" Another voice joined the conversation. Female, elderly, speaking first in Kiowa, then switching to English. "I am Grandmother White Dove. I have lived 93 winters. I have seen white men come, seen promises made and broken." Her voice carried the weight of decades of observation. "This woman is not responsible for the crimes of her people," Grandmother White Dove continued. "And she has been touched by the Great Spirit's hand. Those who walk in darkness often carry a special sight." The elder's support surprised Margaret. She bowed her head respectfully, uncertain how to respond. Chief Grey Wolf seemed to consider the grandmother's words carefully. "She may remain for 7 days, he finally decided, under Running Elk's responsibility. Then we will decide her future." Running Elk thanked the chief formally. The council continued briefly, addressing other tribal matters before adjourning. As the members dispersed, Margaret remained seated, processing the temporary reprieve she'd been granted. 7 days is not long, she murmured to Running Elk. Time enough for the truth to emerge, he replied cryptically. Come, Singing Bird has arranged shelter for you in her lodge. They exited the council house into the cool evening air, now filled with the sounds and scents of the camp's evening meal preparations. Children's voices called out questions as they passed, quickly hushed by adults. Margaret felt herself the center of attention, despite her inability to see the curious eyes following her progress. Singing Bird's dwelling proved to be a well-constructed lodge, larger than Margaret had expected, with a central fire pit providing warmth and light. The medicine woman guided Margaret's hands to explore the space, helping her create a mental map of her temporary sanctuary. Here you will sleep, Singing Bird explained, showing her a sleeping platform covered with soft furs. And here your belongings may rest. She indicated a small storage shelf near the bed. Your kindness overwhelms me, Margaret said sincerely. Why do you welcome me when others are suspicious? Singing Bird was silent for a moment, arranging items around the fire. I have seen visions of your coming, she said finally. 3 moons ago, when autumn first touched the leaves, the spirit showed me a woman walking between worlds, eyes clouded but spirit clear. Margaret's breath caught. You foresaw me? Perhaps, the medicine woman allowed. Or perhaps one like you. The spirits seldom speak plainly. She placed a wooden bowl of fragrant stew in Margaret's hands. Eat now. Tomorrow brings new challenges. As Margaret ate the unfamiliar but delicious meal, she heard Running Elk speaking with Singing Bird in low tones by the lodge's entrance. Though they conversed in Kiowa, the tension in their voices transcended language barriers. Is something wrong? She asked when Running Elk approached to bid her good night. Nothing you need concern yourself with tonight, he replied, his usual straightforwardness softened but still present. I will return at dawn. Where will you sleep? Margaret asked, suddenly anxious at the prospect of navigating this new environment without him. I have my own lodge, Running Elk explained. Not far. 4 dwellings toward the rising sun. The information was provided in his typical way. Practical directions she could use rather than vague reassurance. Margaret appreciated it more than she could express. After Running Elk departed, Singing Bird helped Margaret prepare for sleep, showing her where water was kept for washing and guiding her through the unfamiliar nighttime rituals of Kiowa life. The medicine woman spoke little, but her movements communicated efficiency and unexpected gentleness. As Margaret settled onto the sleeping platform, wrapped in soft furs against the autumn chill, she found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. From the cabin that had become her sanctuary to this camp full of strangers, some hostile, some curious, some inexplicably welcoming, her world had expanded and contracted simultaneously. Here she was safe from wolves and weather, yet vulnerable in new ways. The 7-day reprieve felt both generous and painfully brief. What would happen when that time expired? Would the council send her away? And if so, where? As sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was of Running Elk. His steady presence, his unfailing honesty, and the space between their worlds that seemed both unbridgeable and somehow already crossed. Margaret woke to unfamiliar sounds. Women's voices conversing softly in Kiowa, the rhythmic thud of corn being ground, children laughing as they darted past Singing Bird's lodge. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place herself, the cabin and forest momentarily confused with this new reality. "You are awake," Singing Bird observed, her steps light as she approached Margaret's sleeping platform. "Did the spirits bring you dreams?" Margaret sat up, orienting herself to the medicine woman's voice. "I dreamed of crossing water," she admitted, "a wide river with no bridge or boat, yet somehow I wasn't afraid." Singing Bird made a sound of interest. "Water dreams are powerful. They speak of change, of boundaries crossed." She pressed a wooden cup into Margaret's hands. "Drink, morning tea with honey and herbs for strength." The tea was aromatic and soothing, unlike anything Margaret had tasted before. As she sipped, Singing Bird explained the day ahead. "The women have questions about you," she said matter-of-factly. "They wonder how a blind woman manages without sight. I told them you would show them." Anxiety fluttered in Margaret's chest. "Show them what exactly?" "Your skills, your ways of knowing the world." Singing Bird's tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable. Before Margaret could formulate a response, Running Elk's familiar step sounded outside, followed by his voice requesting entry. Singing Bird called permission, and he entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of morning air and pine. "You've rested well?" he inquired, his voice carrying its usual calm assurance. "Yes, though apparently I'm to give demonstrations of blind living today," Margaret replied, unable to keep a hint of nervousness from her voice. Running Elk seemed to consider this. "The people must know you," he said finally. "Fear comes from not understanding. And if I fail to impress them," Margaret challenged, setting aside her empty cup. "Be yourself," Running Elk advised simply. "No more, no less." After a breakfast of unfamiliar but satisfying corn cakes and dried berries, Margaret was led outside to begin what would become one of the strangest days of her life. Women of the village approached, hesitant at first, then with growing boldness, asking questions through Running Elk or Singing Bird about how she navigated without sight. "How do you know what food is before you?" asked one young mother, her voice curious rather than unkind. "By smell, by touch, sometimes by listening to how it's described," Margaret explained, demonstrating by identifying the items in a nearby basket: corn, dried squash, and what she guessed correctly to be hickory. "Nuts, and your clothing?" another woman inquired. "How do you choose what to wear?" "I memorize each piece by its texture and weight," Margaret explained, "though I admit colors are beyond me now, unless someone describes them." As the morning progressed, Margaret moved from demonstrating basic skills to actively teaching some of her methods. She showed a group of attentive women how she counted steps between important locations, how she identified people by their footsteps and voices, and how she arranged her belongings in consistent patterns for easy location. To her surprise, the women began offering their own suggestions, clever adaptations she hadn't considered. One elderly weaver demonstrated how particular knotting patterns could be used to mark different containers by touch. Another showed how specific scents, pine, mint, sweetgrass, could be used to distinguish otherwise similar items. "Your people truly value practical knowledge," Margaret observed to Running Elk during a brief respite. "Survival depends on it," he replied, "and on sharing what is learned." By midday, Margaret had graduated from curiosity to something approaching acceptance among the village women. Children still followed her movements with whispered comments, but their initial wariness had transformed into fascination. As they shared the midday meal, Standing Bear approached, speaking rapidly to Running Elk in Kiowa. The conversation carried tension that Margaret could sense even without understanding the words. "What's happened?" she asked when they finished. Running Elk hesitated. "Scouts report riders approaching from the direction of Fort Carson. 6 men, armed. At least 2 are soldiers." Margaret's stomach tightened. "Looking for me?" "Perhaps." Running Elk allowed, "or perhaps a routine patrol. Either way, Chief Grey Wolf has ordered preparations." "What kind of preparations?" Margaret asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Women and children gather in lodges, warriors to defensive positions." He paused. "You must be hidden." Before Margaret could respond, Singing Bird joined them, speaking urgently in Kiowa. After a brief exchange, Running Elk turned back to Margaret. "Come quickly." He took her arm, guiding her away from the central village area, their pace swift, forcing Margaret to trust his guidance completely as they navigated between lodges. "Where are we going?" she asked, struggling to keep her footing on the unfamiliar terrain. "Grandmother White Dove's lodge," Running Elk explained tersely. "It sits apart from others, less likely to be searched, and she is respected. Soldiers might hesitate to disturb an elder." They reached the dwelling minutes later, Running Elk announcing their arrival in Kiowa. A creaking voice responded, granting entry. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke, warmer than Singing Bird's home and somehow more ancient. "So," Grandmother White Dove said in her accented English, "the blind woman brings trouble to our door already." "I'm sorry," Margaret began, but the elderly woman interrupted with a dry chuckle. "When has truth ever needed an apology? Sit, both of you. What comes will come." Running Elk guided Margaret to a sitting mat before speaking in rapid Kiowa with the grandmother. Their conversation was brief but intense, ending with Running Elk addressing Margaret again. "I must join the warriors," he explained. "You will remain here with grandmother. Do exactly as she instructs." Running Elk. Margaret caught his arm. As he prepared to leave, sudden fear gripping her. "If they're looking for me, perhaps I should simply go with them, prevent any conflict." His hand covered hers briefly. "We do not yet know their purpose, and those who abandoned you once may have reasons beyond concern for doing so again." With that cryptic warning, he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with the ancient grandmother. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional snap of the central fire. "You care for Mawissa," Grandmother White Dove observed suddenly. "Your voice changes when you speak to him." Heat rushed to Margaret's cheeks. "He saved my life. He's been kind when others were not." The old woman hummed non-committally. "Kind? Kindness and love are different rivers, though they sometimes flow together." Before Margaret could respond to this uncomfortably perceptive observation, distant voices carried from the village center. English voices, demanding and authoritative, met with measured Kiowa responses. "They come," Grandmother White Dove said unnecessarily. "Now we listen." The next hour passed with excruciating slowness. Margaret strained to hear what was happening, catching only fragments of conversations, raised voices, occasional commands, the constant translation between English and Kiowa. "What are they saying?" she asked finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer. "They search for a missing woman," Grandmother White Dove replied. "Offer payment for information. Speak of treaty obligations." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "And our people's response?" The old woman chuckled at her use of "our people." but answered directly. Chief Grey Wolf tells them no white woman has come to the village, offers them food, suggests a storm may have carried missing one to the river. A new thought struck Margaret with chilling clarity. What if they search the lodges? They will not find you, Grandmother White Dove stated with absolute certainty. Come. To Margaret's astonishment, the elderly woman led her to what felt like a small opening in the lodge's rear wall, concealed behind hanging furs. Crawl through, she instructed. Storage pit beneath, used during harsh winters and troubled times. Margaret obeyed, ducking through the opening and lowering herself into a shallow pit lined with fragrant cedar. Grandmother White Dove passed down a fur to cover her, then began to rearrange items above, creating, Margaret realized, a concealed hiding place that would appear to be simple storage. Be still as stone, the grandmother advised before moving. A way to reseal the entrance. Margaret huddled in the darkness, no different to her blind eyes, but somehow more complete in its isolation. Time lost meaning as she waited, every sound from above magnified by fear and uncertainty. Footsteps eventually approached the lodge. Heavy boots, unlike the softer tread of moccasins. Male voices spoke in English, asking questions that Grandmother White Dove answered in deliberately broken, halting responses. Old woman alone, she told them. No white woman here. Only herbs, medicines. A man's voice responded with barely concealed impatience. We have authority to search all dwellings in the village. Step aside. Margaret held her breath as footsteps entered the lodge, moving about with little regard for the sanctity of the space. She could hear items being shifted, furs thrown aside, containers opened. What's this? A different voice demanded. Winter food, Grandmother White Dove replied calmly. Roots, dried meat, corn. Old women must prepare for cold moons. The search continued for what felt like eternity, boots passing directly over Margaret's, in hiding place more than once. Finally, a disgusted voice declared, Nothing here, just an old squaw's junk. The insult brought no response from Grandmother White Dove, though Margaret felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. The footsteps retreated, accompanied by a final warning about treaty obligations and harboring fugitives. Only when silence had reigned for many minutes did the hidden entrance reopen, Grandmother White Dove's weathered hands reaching down to help Margaret emerge from her hiding place. They are gone, Margaret asked, brushing dust from her skirts. From this lodge, yes. They still search the others. The grandmother's voice carried a weariness that hadn't been present before. Men who seek you speak with forked tongues. They call you cherished daughter and poor lost woman, yet their eyes hold other purposes. Margaret absorbed this troubling assessment. Did you recognize any of them? Was Richard Holloway among them? I know not these names, Grandmother White Dove replied, but one man wore fine cloth, not soldier clothes. His hands were soft, unused to work. He offered most gold for finding you. A chill ran through Margaret. Richard had never had soft hands, always priding himself on working his land alongside his hired men. Who, then, searched for her with such determination? And more importantly, why? Evening descended on the village with an unnatural quiet. The usual sounds of community life, children playing, women calling to one another, men returning from hunting, were muted, as if the entire settlement held its breath. Margaret remained in Grandmother White Dove's dwelling, the old woman refusing to let her return to Singing Bird's home until she deemed it safe. Soldiers circle like vultures, the grandmother explained, stoking her small fire. They make camp at the forest edge. Say they return tomorrow. Margaret's anxiety deepened with this news. They won't simply leave, not until they find what they seek. Or who? Grandmother White Dove replied heavily. Heavy footsteps approached the dwelling, too heavy for Running Elk, Margaret realized with a flutter of alarm. But Grandmother White Dove seemed unconcerned, calling out welcome in Kiowa. Chief. Grey Wolf entered, his presence filling the small space with authority. He spoke briefly with the grandmother in their language before addressing Margaret directly. "The men who search for you are persistent," he said, his English deliberate but clear. "They offer much gold, speak of reward for your safe return." Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't understand why they would offer a reward for someone they deliberately abandoned." "Perhaps this is a question you should ask," the chief suggested. "The leader of these men waits at the forest edge. He asks to speak with any who might have seen a blind woman from a settler caravan." "A trap, surely," Margaret protested. "If I go to him, they'll simply take me." The village council gathered that evening in unprecedented urgency. Margaret sat beside Running Elk near the central fire, the heat warming her face as voices debated in Kiowa around her. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tones conveyed the gravity of the situation: concern, anger, strategic calculation. Running Elk translated key points in hushed whispers. Some believe Donovan will bring soldiers, others think he will not risk exposing his crimes. "And the chief?" Margaret asked quietly. "What does he believe?" "That trouble comes regardless of what we do now," Running Elk replied. "The question is how to meet it." The debate continued late into the night, periodically shifting to English when questions were directed to Margaret. She answered truthfully, explaining what she knew of Donovan's connections, his influence in the military, and the complexities of her situation. "I have no proof of what he's done," she admitted when directly questioned by an elder. "Only suspicions and his reaction to grandmother's words. Sometimes reaction tells more truth than carefully chosen words," the elder observed. As the council neared its conclusion, Chief Grey Wolf posed a question that silenced the gathered members. Running Elk hesitated before translating. "He asks, where your loyalty lies now," he explained carefully. "With your own people or with those who saved you?" The question struck Margaret with unexpected force. A month ago, the answer would have seemed obvious. Despite her abandonment, she remained a white settler woman, bound to her culture by birth and upbringing. But now, "My loyalty," she said slowly, "lies with those who treated me as a person of worth, not as a burden to be discarded or a possession to be controlled. The Kiowa have shown me more humanity than those of my own blood. I would not bring harm to this village." Her answer prompted murmured responses, some approving, others clearly skeptical. Chief Grey Wolf spoke again, longer. "This time, the chief says you have been granted 7 days among us," Running Elk translated. "That time has passed, but the council extends it indefinitely. You may stay as one of our people if that is your choice." The unexpected offer left Margaret momentarily speechless. "I would be welcome to stay permanently as family," Running Elk confirmed, something softer entering his typically measured voice. "As one of us." 3 days later, Margaret stood at the camp's edge beside Running Elk, her face turned toward the warming rays of the morning sun. They had received word that Donovan and his men had departed from Fort Carson, recalled to Virginia by Superior. Officers who had received anonymous information about missing regimental funds. The evidence my husband left, Margaret mused. Richard must have sent it to the military authorities when he realized Donovan was hunting him. A bitter smile crossed her lips. Self-preservation, not conscience. Your path is clear now. Running Elk observed, "You could return to your people safely." Margaret turned her face toward him, wishing not for the first time that she could see his expression. "My people are here now." She reached out, finding his hand with practiced ease. "You once told me that a blind woman is not a burden among the Kiowa, but someone who often sees more clearly with her spirit." "It is true," Running Elk replied, his fingers tightening around hers. "Then see this truth," Margaret said softly. "I choose to stay, not from fear or necessity, but because here I found myself again. With you, I learned that blindness is not weakness, just a different way of moving through the world." Winter settled over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains with crystalline beauty Margaret could sense but not see. The snow that had once threatened her life now insulated the lodge she shared with Running Elk, for they had married in a ceremony that blended Kiowa traditions with elements from her past. Grandmother White Dove had blessed their union, declaring Margaret's river dream fulfilled. She had crossed the water and chosen her path. As the cold months deepened, Margaret's position in the tribe strengthened. Her knowledge of English and settler ways proved valuable in negotiations with officials from Fort Carson. Her practical adaptations to blindness became teaching tools for children and injured warriors alike. She learned Kiowa with dedicated practice, her ear for language, compensating for her lack of sight, but most significant was the change within herself. The woman who had once been defined by what she had lost now defined herself by what she had found: strength, purpose, love, and a community that valued her, not despite her differences, but because of them. In the spring, when the mountain snows began to melt and the first shoots pushed through warming soil, Margaret and Running Elk traveled back to the cabin where he had first sheltered her. They found it untouched, waiting as if time had paused within its walls. "Why have we returned?" Margaret asked as they stepped inside, her fingers finding the familiar contours of the space where her journey had begun. Running, Elk guided her hand to the wall near the entrance. "To build something new. This place saved your life once. Perhaps it can save others." Together, with help from the tribe, they expanded the cabin into a way station, a place of refuge for those caught between worlds. Here, injured travelers could find healing. Here, those seeking understanding between settler and native cultures could meet on neutral ground. Here, their stories would continue to unfold together, not as separate peoples, but as bridges spanning the divisions others thought impassable. And as for Captain Donovan, the evidence Daniel Holloway had concealed in his effects, a coded ledger and damning letters, eventually reached military authorities through channels Richard Holloway had established before his own untimely death. In a Silver Creek mining accident, the captain faced court-martial and disgrace, his crimes exposed by the very woman he had sought to silence. Years later, visitors to the mountains would tell of a remarkable sight: a Kiowa scout and his blind wife, builders of an outpost that served as sanctuary for those in need, regardless of origin. They spoke of a woman who navigated the wilderness with uncanny precision, who taught others to see with more than eyes, and whose story served as testament to the resilience of the human spirit. For Margaret Holloway had indeed died in that storm, as the Holloways had reported, but Margaret Running Elk had been born from that same tempest, a woman who had lost her sight but found her vision, who had been abandoned by blood but embraced by choice, who had crossed the river between worlds and built a bridge for others to follow. If this remarkable story of survival, transformation, and unexpected connection has touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Has life ever led you down an unexpected path that turned out to be exactly where you needed to go? Stories like Margaret's remind us that sometimes our greatest strengths emerge from our deepest challenges, and that genuine human connection can transcend the boundaries others create. Next week, we'll bring you another extraordinary tale of courage against impossible odds. The story of a young Civil War drummer boy, separated from his regiment, who found himself protected by the very enemy he had been taught to fear. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss these glimpses into history's forgotten heroes and the moments that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, remember that the most profound journeys often begin when we're forced off our intended path.